Marcus Rhen had exactly 72 hours remaining on his contract when he made the decision that would either save his professional reputation or destroy it completely. He sat in his temporary quarters in the Imperial Palace complex, staring at schematics of the throne room on his workstation display, and tried one more time to convince himself there was another option that didn't involve committing what the Telvathi Empire considered a capital offense. 3 months. He'd spent 3 months evaluating security vulnerabilities in what was supposed to be the most impenetrable palace complex in known space. The Telvathi weren't just proud of their security, they were legendary for it. 40 star systems, 30-year reign of Empress Kavara the Unyielding, multiple crushed rebellions, and exactly 0 successful breaches of imperial security in recorded history, spanning back 4 centuries. Then a visiting dignitary from a tributary state had nearly been assassinated during a formal reception. And suddenly, the Telvathi needed to acknowledge that maybe, possibly, their traditional security approaches had some gaps that required outside expertise to identify and address. That's where Marcus came in. Recommended by 3 neutral security firms, human enough to provide genuinely outside perspective, experienced enough with diverse species security protocols to understand both Telvathi cultural constraints and modern threat vectors. His contract was explicit and clear. Evaluate vulnerabilities, propose solutions, implement nothing without formal imperial approval. He'd found 27 significant security gaps. 24 had been addressed through updated protocols and technology the Telvathi already possessed, but hadn't properly implemented due to institutional resistance to changing traditional practices that had always worked before. The Security Council had grudgingly accepted most of his recommendations after seeing detailed threat modeling that demonstrated how each vulnerability could be exploited. But 3 vulnerabilities remained unresolved, and one of them was going to get the Empress killed. Marcus zoomed in on the throne room schematic, highlighting the areas he'd identified as critical weakness points. The room itself was a masterpiece of Telvathi architecture. Vast space with soaring ceilings, columns carved from single pieces of stone transported from their homeworld. The throne platform elevated just enough to command visual dominance while maintaining the Telvathi cultural principle that power should be visible and accessible rather than distant and remote. The security approach matched that philosophy, overwhelming visible force. Guards in formal armor positioned throughout the room, their weapons openly displayed. Scanning systems at every entrance checking for prohibited items. Multiple layers of identity verification before anyone got within 50 meters of the Empress. The entire design communicated one message: we are so powerful that we need not hide our defenses, and you would be foolish to challenge us. It was impressive. It was culturally meaningful. It had worked flawlessly for centuries. And it had one catastrophic blind spot. It assumed anyone who made it into the throne room had already been thoroughly screened and therefore posed minimal threat. Internal defenses were minimal because the Telvathi believed the external screening was sufficient. Marcus knew from professional experience, spanning 3 decades and 17 different species security systems, that this assumption was dangerously wrong. Screening procedures could be defeated through technical sophistication, social engineering, or compromise of trusted personnel. The more you relied exclusively on perimeter security, the more vulnerable you became to threats that made it past that perimeter. He designed a countermeasure system specifically for the throne room's vulnerability. It was elegant, concealed within existing architectural elements, activated by detected energy weapon signatures or manual trigger, purely defensive rather than offensive, non-lethal, designed to give the Empress precious seconds to escape or for guards to respond effectively. He'd presented it to the Imperial Security Council 3 weeks ago. The response had been immediate, unanimous, and utterly final. Rejected as culturally incompatible with Telvathi principles regarding transparent power and non-concealment in the presence of the throne. You suggest hiding defensive capabilities where the Empress holds court. Security Counselor Preeth had demanded, his elongated ears flat against his head in the Telvathi expression of profound disapproval. That violates every principle our empire is built upon. Power should be visible. Strength should be demonstrated openly. We do not hide behind tricks and secret defenses like species too weak to display their capabilities honestly. Marcus had tried to explain that modern threats required modern responses, that preparedness wasn't the same as deception, that having concealed defenses didn't diminish visible power, but complemented it with prudent readiness for scenarios that visible force alone couldn't address. The council hadn't been interested in his arguments. The vote was unanimous, rejected. He was instructed to propose alternatives that didn't involve concealment. He'd tried. Suggested visible defensive installations, rejected as aesthetically incompatible with the throne room's architecture and culturally inappropriate for surrounding the throne with obvious protective technology. Enhanced guard protocols, rejected as insufficient to address energy weapon threats that could kill before guards could react. Restricted access procedures, rejected as incompatible with the Telvathi tradition of the throne being accessible to any imperial subject with legitimate business. Every alternative was either culturally unacceptable or operationally inadequate. The fundamental vulnerability remained. The throne room had almost no defense against someone already inside it who decided to attack with directed energy weapons. Marcus ran probability models based on historical assassination attempt patterns across multiple species. The math was clear and depressing. Given the known vulnerability, given the number of people who cycled through the throne room during formal court sessions, given the sophistication of modern concealment technology, the probability of a successful assassination attempt approached certainty over a 10-year timeline. Maybe longer if they were lucky, maybe shorter if they weren't. Someone would eventually figure out the vulnerability and exploit it. Maybe an external enemy, maybe an internal rival, maybe some individual with a grievance and access to the right technology. The when and how didn't matter as much as the certainty that it would happen. Marcus had two ethical obligations in direct conflict. Professional ethics demanded he respect the contract he'd signed and the explicit rejection of his proposed solution by the authority that had hired him. Follow the rules. Acknowledge cultural constraints. Submit his final report noting the unresolved vulnerability, wash his hands of the consequences, and move on to his next contract. Personal ethics demanded he prevent foreseeable harm when he had the capability to do so. The Empress was a living person whose death he could prevent with reasonable effort. The fact that her own government rejected his solution due to cultural preferences didn't change the moral calculation that he could save her life if he chose to act. 3 sleepless nights of wrestling with this impossible choice before Marcus made his decision. He'd chosen personal ethics over professional protocol once before in his career, 15 years ago, working palace security for a planetary governor who'd rejected recommendations about internal surveillance. Marcus had implemented covert monitoring anyway, caught a coup attempt in its planning stages, and prevented a civil war that would have killed thousands. He'd also been fired and blacklisted from that entire star system for violating contract terms and cultural norms about surveillance of trusted officials. But the planetary governor was alive. Thousands of people weren't dead. And Marcus could live with professional consequences easier than he could live with preventable deaths. He pulled up the concealed countermeasure design on his workstation and began refining the implementation plan. If he was going to commit treason against Telvathi cultural principles, he was going to do it right. Implementation took 2 weeks of careful, methodical work that made Marcus feel simultaneously like a professional craftsman and a criminal violating trust. He had legitimate access to the throne room as security consultant. His contract included provisions for installing diagnostic equipment to monitor security system performance. The Telvathi guards and maintenance staff were accustomed to seeing him working in various locations throughout the palace complex, running tests, checking sensor arrays, updating system configurations. None of them realized that what he was installing was far more sophisticated than routine diagnostic gear. The countermeasure system components were small enough to conceal within existing architectural elements. Energy field generators hidden inside decorative column capitals. Electromagnetic pulse emitters disguised as lighting fixture components. Sensor arrays integrated with existing security monitoring equipment. Power distribution routed through legitimate palace systems, but isolated enough that activation wouldn't be obvious until the moment of deployment. He worked during scheduled maintenance windows when his presence wouldn't be questioned, kept detailed technical logs that would pass casual review but concealed the actual purpose of what he was installing. Used specialized components he'd brought with him under the legitimate cover of diagnostic equipment for his security evaluation work. The system was designed with multiple safeguards and ethical constraints. Activation required two conditions: verified energy weapon signature detection or manual trigger by Marcus himself. It wouldn't deploy based on false positives or automatic hair trigger responses. The defensive fields and electromagnetic pulses were calibrated to be non-lethal, purely protective. They would disable personal electronics and create barrier shields, but wouldn't harm anyone directly. The system was keyed to Marcus's biometric signature and a physical activation device, a small medallion he'd manufactured using palace fabrication equipment during legitimate testing of their manufacturing security protocols. The medallion looked like decorative jewelry incorporating traditional Telvathi design elements, but contained quantum-encrypted wireless trigger circuitry. He designed deactivation to be immediate and responsive to Imperial command. If the Empress ordered shutdown, the system would comply instantly. This wasn't about establishing control or threatening the throne. It was purely about having defensive capability ready when needed. By the time Marcus finished installation and testing, he'd created a defensive network that could activate in under 2 seconds from threat detection, would protect the throne platform long enough for guards to respond and the Empress to reach secure locations, and could be manually triggered if his professional assessment identified a threat that automated sensors hadn't detected yet. He'd also committed multiple counts of what Telvathi law would consider treason if discovered: concealing capabilities in the presence of the throne, implementing security measures without imperial authorization, deceiving palace officials about the nature and purpose of installed systems. The penalty for such violations was execution. The Telvathi didn't imprison people who violated sacred cultural principles about transparency before the throne. They made examples of them to ensure others understood the seriousness of such offenses. Marcus finished his final system check 72 hours before his scheduled departure from Telvathi space. Everything worked flawlessly. The system was completely concealed, would activate only when necessary, could be manually controlled if needed, and represented the best defensive capability he could provide given the constraints he was operating under. He submitted his final security evaluation report to the Imperial Security Council. 27 vulnerabilities identified, 24 addressed through implemented solutions, 3 remaining unresolved due to cultural constraints that prevented adequate technical responses. The report was professional, comprehensive, and honest about what had been accomplished and what limitations remained. The Council accepted his report, thanked him formally for his service, and transferred the final payment for his contract. He was scheduled to depart in 3 days. Then, 2 days before his planned departure, Marcus received a summons that made his blood run cold. Marcus Rhen, security consultant, you are formally summoned to attend Imperial Court Session 7429, to be held at the 2nd hour of formal proceedings tomorrow. Your presence is required. Failure to attend will be considered hostile act against the Empire. Not a private meeting, not a security debriefing. Full formal court session with hundreds of nobles, officials, visiting dignitaries, and media present. The kind of session where imperial judgments were pronounced publicly, where honors were bestowed or punishments decreed, where the Empress demonstrated her authority before witnesses representing all levels of Telvathi society. Marcus read the summons 3 times, his mind cycling through possibilities. Had they discovered what he'd done? Had someone noticed the concealed components during routine maintenance? Had his technical logs been reviewed more carefully than he'd anticipated? He spent a sleepless night preparing for the strong possibility that he'd be accused of treason before the entire imperial court, tried publicly, and executed as an example of what happened to those who violated sacred principles about transparency and non-concealment before the throne. The morning of the court session, Marcus dressed in formal attire appropriate for appearing before the Empress. clothing that incorporated both human professional standards and Telvathi cultural expectations for respect and propriety. He wore the medallion openly as decorative jewelry, figuring that hiding it now would be pointless if they'd already discovered what he'd done. He walked through palace corridors toward the throne room with the certainty of someone approaching his own execution, trying to maintain dignity and calm despite the fear making his hands want to shake. The throne room was packed. Hundreds of Telvathi nobles and officials in their formal attire, visiting dignitaries from tributary states and allied powers, court functionaries managing the ceremonial aspects of imperial sessions, media recording everything for broadcast across the empire. The kind of audience that gathered when something significant was about to happen. Marcus took his position in the section designated for visiting specialists and consultants, people important enough to be present, but not high-ranking enough for proximity to the throne. He tried not to look at the decorative columns where components of his concealed system were hidden. Tried not to think about the fact that he was standing in direct violation of everything the Telvathi held sacred about transparent power and non-deception in the presence of the throne. Empress Kavara, the unyielding, sat elevated on her throne of carved crystal, surrounded by advisors and guards in their formal positions. Her elongated ears were positioned in what Marcus's limited cultural knowledge identified as judicial formality, prepared to pronounce judgment and dispense imperial authority. She looked exactly like what she was, an absolute ruler who had crushed rebellions, expanded an empire, and tolerated no challenge to her authority or dignity. The court session proceeded through its formal ceremony, officials presenting reports, nobles requesting imperial judgment on various disputes, the routine business of governing 40 star systems and billions of subjects. Marcus stood in his designated position, trying to control his breathing and appear calm, waiting to be called forward to account for his violation of Telvathi cultural law. Then something happened that made Marcus forget about his own legal jeopardy entirely. A visiting dignitary from one of the tributary states, a Telvathi male wearing formal robes indicating mid-level nobility, someone who had passed all security screenings and had legitimate business presenting a petition to the throne, made a subtle movement that Marcus's trained eye caught instantly. The dignitary's left hand was reaching inside his formal robes. Not a casual gesture, not normal adjustment of clothing. The body language was wrong, weight shifting forward, center of gravity preparing for action rather than maintaining ceremonial stillness, eyes tracking distances and angles in a way that screamed threat assessment rather than respectful observation. Marcus's professional instincts kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. His hand moved to the medallion beneath his collar, fingers finding the activation sequence, muscle memory from 2 weeks of testing taking over. He activated the hidden device. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Power readings throughout the throne room spiked as concealed systems drew from palace energy grids. Defensive energy barriers shimmered into visibility around the throne platform, creating translucent shields between the Empress and the rest of the room. Simultaneously, directional electromagnetic pulse generators concealed in column capitals and lighting fixtures discharged precisely calibrated bursts designed to disable personal electronics without damaging palace infrastructure. The would-be assassin's hand emerged from his robes, holding what Marcus's professional eye recognized as a compact directed energy pistol. Sophisticated enough to pass most scanning procedures if someone knew the right shielding techniques. Powerful enough to kill from 20 meters. Exactly the kind of threat Marcus had warned the Security Council about. The weapon sparked and died before the dignitary could bring it to firing position, its electronics fried by the electromagnetic pulse. He stood frozen, assassination attempt thwarted before it could begin, weapon now just useless metal in his hand. Guards were moving, finally processing what was happening and responding to the obvious threat. But they were seconds too late. If Marcus's countermeasures hadn't activated, the Empress would already be dead. The entire throne room had gone absolutely silent. Hundreds of people collectively holding their breath, because they'd all just witnessed something that should be impossible. A human consultant activating hidden defensive systems in the throne room, revealing concealed capabilities in the presence of the Empress, violating the sacred principle of transparent power that the entire Telvathi Empire was built upon. Empress Kavara, still protected behind the shimmering energy barrier, locked eyes with Marcus across the throne room. Her ears were positioned in an expression Marcus had never seen documented in any cultural briefing, complex pattern suggesting simultaneous shock, assessment, rage, and possibly something else entirely. The seconds stretched. Marcus stood with his hand still on the medallion, acutely aware that he just committed treason in front of hundreds of witnesses and billions watching via broadcast media. Guards had subdued the would-be assassin, but their attention was split between the captured threat and Marcus himself, uncertain which posed greater danger. Empress Kavara raised one hand, a gesture that commanded absolute silence and stillness throughout the court. Her voice carried through the silent throne room with authority accumulated over 30 years of absolute rule. Deactivate. Marcus touched the medallion again, inputting the shutdown sequence. The energy barriers faded. Power readings normalized. The throne room returned to its normal state, except now everyone knew about the hidden defenses that weren't supposed to exist. Approach, the Empress commanded. Marcus walked forward through a crowd that parted before him like he carried contagious plague. Every eye tracked his movement, every ear positioned to catch whatever came next. He stopped at the traditional distance from the throne platform and performed the formal Telvathi gesture of respect and submission. Though he suspected traditional protocol was about to become completely irrelevant. "You concealed defensive capabilities in my throne room," Empress Kavara said, not a question. A statement of observed fact that everyone present had just witnessed. "Yes, Your Majesty," Marcus confirmed. No point in denying what hundreds of people had seen with their own eyes. "Without permission, without disclosure to my Security Council, in direct violation of our cultural principles regarding transparency and non-concealment before the throne." "Yes, Your Majesty." Her ears shifted to a new position, something that made several advisors near the throne whisper urgently to each other. "And yet," the Empress continued, her voice carrying absolute command of the moment, "you just used those concealed capabilities to prevent my assassination, to defend me against a threat that our own security protocols, the same protocols my Security Council insisted were adequate, failed to detect or prevent." "Yes, Your Majesty." Around the throne room, Telvathi officials were engaged in urgent whispered conversations, trying to process the paradox of someone committing treason and preventing assassination simultaneously. Empress Kavara leaned forward slightly, a subtle shift in posture that made her guards tense and her advisors fall silent. "Explain to me, Marcus Rhen, why you implemented these defenses after my Security Council explicitly rejected your proposal as culturally incompatible with our values." This was it, the moment where Marcus either justified the violation or confirmed himself as traitor who valued his own judgment above imperial authority. "Because I knew someone would eventually exploit the vulnerability, Your Majesty. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but I knew with professional certainty that it would happen. The throne room's security approach assumes that anyone who makes it past perimeter screening poses minimal threat. That assumption is dangerously wrong. Modern concealment technology, social engineering, compromise of trusted personnel. There are multiple vectors through which someone with sufficient motivation and resources could defeat screening procedures and bring weapons into this room." Marcus paused, then continued. "When the Security Council rejected my proposal, I understood their cultural reasoning. Transparent power, visible strength, not hiding behind tricks and secret defenses. Those are meaningful principles. But they're principles that create a vulnerability someone eventually would exploit. I couldn't leave knowing that foreseeable threat existed that I could have prevented. Even though implementing defenses without authorization violated your contract and our laws," the Empress asked. "Even though," Marcus confirmed, "I weighed professional ethics against preventing your death, Your Majesty. I chose to prioritize your survival over my contractual obligations and your cultural comfort with transparent power. You chose to trust your judgment over my explicit commands," Kavara said, "to implement hidden capabilities despite cultural prohibition, to deceive my officials about the nature and purpose of what you installed. Yes, Your Majesty, and I understand that constitutes treason under Telvathi law." I'm prepared to accept the consequences. But I'm not sorry I did it, because you're alive right now and that assassination attempt just failed. If I'd followed the Security Council's rejection and left those defenses unimplemented, you'd be dead. The Empress sat back, her expression unreadable, her ears cycling through positions Marcus couldn't interpret. The throne room remained absolutely silent, hundreds of people waiting to see if she would execute the human who had saved her life, but violated every principle of transparent power the Empire held sacred. You present me with a paradox, Empress Kavara said finally. By hiding your capabilities, you violated our trust, but by revealing them only at the critical moment, using them purely for defense, without threat or leverage or attempt to gain advantage, you demonstrated absolute trustworthiness. By implementing defenses without permission, you committed treason. But by using those defenses only when my life was at immediate risk, and deactivating immediately when I command. Marcus Rhen, Empress Kavara said, her voice resonating through the throne room with the kind of authority that shaped civilizations. You violated our laws and cultural principles. You also prevented my assassination, using capabilities those same principles prevented us from implementing ourselves. Both truths exist simultaneously. Both deserve recognition. She gestured, and Marcus saw several Security Council members reacting with visible shock to whatever the gesture signified. I will not execute you for treason. That would be acknowledging that our rigid adherence to traditional approaches matters more than survival and effective security. It would be declaring that I value cultural comfort over the life you just saved. Relief flooded through Marcus so intensely he had to concentrate on keeping his expression neutral and controlled. However, the Empress continued, I also will not simply ignore what you did. You made a choice to override imperial authority based on your professional judgment. That cannot be without consequences, even when the outcome was positive. Here it comes, Marcus thought. Exile, permanent blacklist, public acknowledgement of violation, even if not execution. Therefore, Kavara said, making another formal gesture, I am appointing you Imperial Security Advisor, with direct authority to implement defensive measures you deem necessary, even when they conflict with traditional approaches. Your judgment today proved better than my entire Security Council's collective wisdom. That deserves recognition and position of authority sufficient to act on that judgment in the future. The throne room erupted in chaos, nobles and officials breaking protocol to express shock and concern and outrage. Several Security Council members looked like they'd been physically struck. Others appeared thoughtful, as if reassessing everything they'd assumed about security and cultural principles. Marcus stood frozen, unable to process the sudden reversal from expected execution to high-level imperial appointment. The Empress raised her hand again, commanding silence. I am also requiring, Marcus Rhen, that you disclose all concealed capabilities to me personally. No more hidden systems I don't know about. No more defensive implementations kept secret from the throne itself. Preparedness is valuable. Today proved that absolutely. But deception, even well-intentioned deception, erodes the trust necessary for effective governance. You will maintain defensive readiness while operating with transparency at the highest level. Can you accept those terms? Marcus found his voice. Yes, Your Majesty. Though I should note that maintaining defensive surprise sometimes requires concealing specific capabilities from potential threats, which might include some court officials if there's any risk of information compromise or. Then you will disclose them to me, Kavara interrupted, and I and my most trusted advisors will determine what information is shared more broadly. The principle stands, no capabilities hidden from the throne itself. From the broader court and potential threats, that becomes a strategic decision we will make together based on your professional assessment of operational security requirements. She sat back down, her posture suggesting the formal judgment was concluded. You showed me today that sometimes safety requires preparation others find uncomfortable. That readiness revealed at the right moment, without aggression, purely for defense, commands more respect than visible force that fails when actually tested. You could have used your hidden system as threat or leverage. You could have revealed it days ago to prove a point or gain political advantage. Instead, you activated it only when my life was at immediate risk, then deactivated immediately when I commanded. That restraint matters as much as the capability itself. Marcus performed the formal gesture of acceptance, his mind still reeling from the appointment and the public validation of what he'd thought was indefensible treason. "Now," Empress Kavara said, her voice hardening as she looked toward where the subdued would-be assassin was being held by guards. "Explain to my Security Council exactly how someone with assassination intent and a concealed directed energy weapon passed their supposedly adequate screening procedures. Because that failure nearly cost me my life despite Marcus Rhen's defensive intervention. And I want detailed explanation of what changes will be implemented to ensure it doesn't happen again." The senior security counselor stepped forward, his ears flat with shame and anger. "Your Majesty, we will conduct immediate full review of all screening procedures and personnel. This should not have been possible. The fact that it represents catastrophic failure that Marcus Rhen warned you about," the Empress interrupted. "When he proposed throne room defensive countermeasures that you rejected as culturally inappropriate. He told you this exact scenario was possible. You dismissed his concerns, and today he saved my life using capabilities you refused to authorize." She let that sink in. "I'm not interested in excuses or promises of review. I want concrete changes implemented immediately, under Marcus Rhen's supervision, with full authority to override cultural objections when security requirements demand. Is that understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," the counselor said, though his expression suggested the words tasted bitter. "Good. This session is concluded. Marcus Rhen remain, the rest of you are dismissed." The throne room emptied in careful procedural order. Highest-ranking nobles and officials first, working down through hierarchical levels until only Empress Kavara, her closest advisors, guards, and Marcus remained. Kavara descended from the throne platform in formal movement that suggested private conversation rather than formal imperial pronouncement. She approached Marcus directly, studying him with intensity that felt like being examined at cellular level. "You took an enormous risk," she said quietly. "Professional, legal, personal. You had to know that if I'd interpreted your actions as threat rather than protection, you'd be dead right now." "I knew, Your Majesty," Marcus confirmed. "But the alternative was leaving you vulnerable to exactly what almost happened today. I couldn't live with that choice." "Why?" Kavara asked. "You'd completed your contract, identified the vulnerabilities, been paid for your work. Our cultural stubbornness wasn't your responsibility. You could have walked away with clear conscience knowing you'd done your professional duty. Why risk everything to implement defenses we'd explicitly rejected?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "Because I've seen too many preventable deaths in my career, Your Majesty. Too many situations where security measures that could have saved lives weren't implemented due to cultural constraints, political calculations, or simple institutional inertia. Too many times I've read after-action reports on assassinations or attacks and thought, we knew this was possible. We just chose not to prepare for it." He paused, then continued. "When I left my last position, 15 years ago, planetary governor who rejected internal surveillance recommendations, I swore I wouldn't make that mistake again. Wouldn't prioritize professional ethics over preventing death when I had the capability to act. That governor is alive today because I violated contract terms and cultural norms to implement covert monitoring that caught a coup attempt. I was fired and blacklisted from that entire system. But thousands of people aren't dead from the civil war that would have followed a successful coup. So you're someone who habitually violates authority when you disagree with decisions," Kavara observed. "I'm someone who prioritizes survival over protocol when the two conflict and lives are at stake," Marcus corrected. "I don't make those choices lightly. I tried every legitimate channel to address your throne room vulnerability. Only after those were exhausted did I implement without authorization. It wasn't casual disregard for your authority. It was calculated decision that your life mattered more than my career or your cultural comfort." Empress Kavara's ears moved through several positions, complex emotional processing that Marcus still couldn't fully decode. "My Security Council is going to hate having you as Imperial Security Advisor. You represent everything they find culturally uncomfortable about modern security approaches, hidden capabilities, deception for defensive purposes, willingness to override traditional approaches when threats demand. Yes, Your Majesty, I expect significant resistance. If you'd prefer to appoint someone more culturally compatible, I prefer to be alive, Kavara interrupted. Which I am because you were willing to be culturally uncomfortable in the service of effective security. The Security Council will adapt or be replaced. You have my authority to implement whatever defensive measures you deem necessary. Just maintain the transparency requirement with me personally. No capabilities I don't know about. Can you work within that constraint? Yes, Your Majesty, though I'll need to understand who else should be in that inner circle of disclosure. Your personal guard commander, certainly. Probably your intelligence chief. Anyone with operational need to know, and whose trustworthiness you're absolutely certain of. We'll establish that circle together, Kavara said, starting with reviewing all the concealed systems you've already implemented. I want complete disclosure of every capability, every activation condition, every potential defensive measure you've hidden in my palace. Marcus pulled out his personal datapad. I can provide full technical documentation right now, Your Majesty. Locations, specifications, activation protocols, power requirements, everything. He spent the next hour walking the Empress and her closest advisors through complete disclosure of the throne room defensive system and 2 other minor countermeasures he'd implemented in high-risk areas during his contract period. Showed them exactly how each system worked, what conditions would trigger activation, how they could be manually controlled, what their limitations were. Kavara listened with intense focus, asking detailed questions that demonstrated she understood both the technical aspects and the strategic implications. By the end, she had complete knowledge of every defensive capability Marcus had secretly implemented. This is how we should have been operating from the beginning, she said finally. Transparent disclosure at the highest levels, strategic concealment from potential threats. Preparedness without deception of those who need to know. Can you build a security system for the entire palace complex operating on these principles? Yes, Your Majesty. It'll take time and resources, and I'll need authority to override cultural objections when security requirements demand. But I can create a defensive network that keeps you safe while maintaining the disclosure relationship you're requiring. Then do it, Kavara commanded. You're Imperial Security Advisor now, that's your mandate. Keep me alive. Keep my government functional. Implement whatever measures you deem necessary. Just make sure I know what you're doing and why. She made a dismissal gesture. Go, start working, and Marcus, thank you for choosing my survival over your professional safety. That's worth more than you can know. Marcus performed the formal respect gesture and departed, his mind already spinning with security system designs and implementation priorities. Behind him, Empress Kavara the Unyielding sat back on her throne and allowed herself a rare moment of private reflection. She'd almost died today. Would have died, except for a human security consultant who'd committed treason to save her life, who'd revealed hidden capabilities at precisely the right moment and used them purely for defense, who demonstrated both preparedness and restraint in ways that commanded more respect than any visible display of force. The court would be talking about this for years. The moment when the Empress nearly died, when hidden defenses activated, when a human activated a device no one knew existed and the entire court stopped breathing. And the moment when she chose to interpret that violation as ultimate trust rather than treason, rewarding someone who prioritized survival over cultural comfort and who revealed capabilities only when absolutely necessary. Sometimes, Kavara reflected, the most important innovations come from people willing to violate sacred principles when those principles create vulnerabilities that cost lives. Sometimes preparedness requires capabilities that make people uncomfortable. Sometimes the most trustworthy individuals are the ones who hide their preparations until the critical moment, then reveal and use them purely for defense before returning to concealment. Marcus Rhen had shown her that today, had proven that controlled restraint and revealed capability at the right moment commanded more respect than constant visible force. She would remember that lesson, and she would trust the human who'd risked everything to keep her alive. The Empire would adapt to this new security approach, or her Security Council would be replaced with people who understood that survival mattered more than cultural comfort. Either way, she'd be alive to see it.